So, before we get into any of the specifics of Egypt, Sumeria, etc. Oh, one second. Oh, good. You're perfectly on time enough. Just when class is over, come see me so I can put you on the roll, okay? Perfect. Thank you very much. All right, so we are going to be talking generically about some of the societies that formed up around the Nile River Valley, as well as, kind of exiting what we began with, the Tigris and Euphrates. That being said, we will mention the Sumerian culture again, just in passing perhaps, but Egypt is definitely on the agenda for today, and hopefully it'll be an interesting class to you. All right, so Nile societies, complex societies in Southwest Asia and the Nile Valley, beginning circa 9000 BCE. And again, there's that lovely circa term. So we're looking at 9,000 plus the 2021 of the Common Era. So do the math on that, 11-ish thousand years ago. So the spread of early humans had begun to pick up speed, and within 5,000 years of that, so again, do your math, 5,000 years, so 4,000-ish BCE, 5,000-ish BCE, 6 to 7,000 years ago, if you prefer. The earliest permanent societies began to spring up throughout almost every geographic type and area of the world. Obviously, we're not talking frozen tundra here, but, within reason, you see human developments by this point building up, and again, especially around rivers and where rivers create fertile soil. That is a very harsh light, by the way. So if y'all see me squinting in class, that's why. Excuse me. One of those types of places that, again, you'll see throughout history is kind of late in developing would be like island chains. Because, again, to get to those places, early humans, and wherever they were to begin with, had to develop reliable naval or boats, naval transportation, big enough boats to get you to those islands to then start colonies on, right? So a couple of things had to happen before island chains get really settled. We still, have not discovered all of these early cultures, of course, and many of them will always remain a mystery to us. They don't have written histories, a lot of them, or at least not ones that we can interpret. And we'll get more to that in a few minutes, importance of writing. However, with the spread of cultural growth, there was a greater growth in new technologies being used by some humans. As we talked about before, as more society occurs, you have a lot more available time as individuals to specialize in hobbies. Hobbies eventually turn into specialization in crafts that you sell. Those typically filled a need that other people had. I mean, you don't have computer programmers at the time to just fill, dead space. It's normally inventing towards a goal of bettering human interactions, right? Like we didn't start out with the fork, but eventually someone had to come up with that concept. That goes all the way back to everything, right? As more people gathered together and grow more food, the human race began to grow much more quickly. As again, we established last class, more food, bigger brains, more food to have more children and feed them to where they grow to reproductive ages. Societies grow, populations grow. As that growth happens, especially in what we're going to find out are grain growing societies, which, rice, millet, oats, wheat, all of those early grains each pop up in different places, India, China, the Americas, etc. But it is the cultivation of grains that is in large part thought to be the starter for a lot of governmental developments. Why, we will get to in just a moment. But it's in the societies that are very heavily reliant on grains and growing grains that we see the earliest developments of what we would see as a state or government. All right. As societies formed these larger populations, governments were formed to help manage the excess grain, share in protection of the growing fields and population. So, raise an army if you need to. Manage taxes, because death and taxes, perhaps an apocryphal saying dedicated to one of our forefathers and founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. There's only two unavoidable things in life, death and taxes. taxes go back a long, long way. So I'm apt to believe what he said. And manage the profits from trade that was developed or gained through, you guessed it, grain excesses. You have enough to make beer and bread. You have extra. What are you going to do? I'm going to trade it for some other goods. Well, once you start doing that with thousands of people in a given area, you're generating revenue. And the people that are in charge, i.e., state government that are starting to form, see those tax revenues as a great way to grow the empire, or the city-state as it was at this point. So the concept began in Mesopotamia, the concept of governments with taxes, managing grains, etc., as far as we can tell. Again, there is always that wiggle room in history of we haven't discovered a place in the Andes that predates Incan society and predates Mesopotamia. I'm not saying one exists. It might. We just don't know. So as far as we know, Mesopotamia, again, the land between two rivers, Tigris-Euphrates area, is where that concept of government first took hold, right? So with that, I'm going to let y'all catch up for a second. Click this. I like how they have it set up with the different colored dots representing what each slide represents. That being said, I'm going to be moving through some more quickly than others as they're already posted. Go back to ones at your own leisure to brush up your notes. This stuff, a lot of it is in the book. Some of it's extra. I like extra, but I'm not going to test you on extra. So unless I make a special point to be like, put this in your notes, otherwise, stick with the textbook and what I'm giving you. This is just bonus. That being said, what I'm covering is in here too. Hopefully I've confused you just a little bit. All right. So the area that we're talking about, again, Tigris and Euphrates, can be referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Obviously, it's somewhat crescent-shaped, that land mass behind me on the map, or that general area. You can see sort of a crescent to it. Not exactly a crescent roll crescent, but, we're getting there. With that, of course, you have the two Tigris and Euphrates rivers there, and you see the growth, again, in southern Mesopotamia, so down here, where it's labeled Sumer. Well, I've always put, again, letter with letter, Sumer with south, S with S. I don't know if that helps anybody else, but it's always helped me. Sumer, or southern Mesopotamia, is again within, we know Mesopotamia to be the first government starting up. It is within the southern region that we believe even closer that it was the first state government forming. So down here around Sumer, right? Now, we're going to get later in the chapter to the Egyptian history and such. But before we get to that, and before we get much into Sumerian Mesopotamian societies, I would like to talk about the importance of writing and how it affects early societies. And this is across the board without being just Sumerian or any of the rest that we're going to get into. So the reason that writing is so important, and again, it developed first in Sumerian Mesopotamia. There's your one link to what I'm going to say up here to that. But why is writing important? I mean, we all remember facts and stories pretty accurately, right? But why are you writing notes? That's why writing is important. You don't remember everything. You can't convey everything I say word of mouth. I mean, if you have a eidetic memory, you might could, or you record what I say now. I mean, technology has changed this a bit. But in general, writing was, to begin with, about more or less what we're doing now, relaying facts. Now, mathematics came into it, taxes again, property lines, but you notice it's a lot of governmental stuff. It's not long sweeping epics or early love poems or early songs, things like that get recorded. There was no need of that at the time. What they needed, though, out of writing, and they being the governments that were forming the states, they needed a way to record tax information, value of things, amount of crops and soldiers that were on hand. And instead of just going, okay, remember we have, We have to come up with a system of numbers before we have numbers. Well, guess what? You see that rise with the concept of writing. Originally, written word was little more than written numbers and concepts for numbers. So we see a few things come with writing and math at the same time. One, the concept of place value. So we all acknowledge that 9 is less than 10 and 11 is greater than 10. Well, the Sumerians were the first people to come up with the concept of place value in that way, with numbers, so to speak. I mean, value had been measured in other ways around the globe. The Incan culture used knotted up colored ropes, different colors and different styles of knots indicated different values. That's nonetheless still a language of sorts that we acknowledge. Those knots, one of your vocab terms, Kiphus, I believe it is, Kiphus. Again, not all early forms of written word or written numbers for this matter were in, as later we'll see, clay tablets or papyrus sheets. So, you'll get what I'm saying about the importance of numbers in its relation to the state, though. Like, as the state grows, government power does not need epic poems, it needs raw information. So it's raw information that develops first as a concept within writing, which in itself is a huge concept. So, as I have written in my notes to drive home the point, Grandma told me a story 20 years ago, and it's kind of like the telephone game. By the time I tell my son, or maybe down the line grandson or granddaughter, about whatever my grandmother told me, it's passed through 4 people. It's not going to be the same concept at the end. But if you write it down and just slide that piece of paper down through the generations, you have a more accurate account. Put that on a grand scheme with history and you see where it comes from. Cool. So I think I've already covered the importance of writing pretty significantly. Does everyone feel more or less comfortable with that? Yeah, I got really behind the time on this, sorry. All right, these first few slides, the Neolithic Southwest Asia, and again to the camera, the slide online, Neolithic Southwest Asia, has to do with why Mesopotamia became the Fertile Crescent or why people moved there in the first place. Again, global warming, big buzzword today. It had an effect on what moved people from what were previously warm climates to, as the Little Ice Age began, driving people into more tropical areas now to seek out warmth and, well, good growing land. However, y'all can get this online. Again, the Levantine quarter, exactly what I was talking about with the progressive movement. All right, this is where we're going though. Sumerian civilization, the importance of writing is now what I would consider complete as a section of notes. If anyone has questions, please let me know. Throw up a hand. If I'm going too fast or I mutter, again, let me know. Throw up a hand. So, very briefly though, while y'all are catching up on the concept, this is a bit beyond what I would ask for on an exam or a quiz necessarily, but some early texts that we still have. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, we've always written on paper. I mean, not in this age group. We all know that we didn't always have paper. But, you talk to kids and it's like, yeah, paper, that's what we've always written on, right? So let's go back to, and again, we'll hit the Sumerian specifically in a moment. Clay tablets were, common throughout several different cultures. The Sumerians we'll get to in a moment being prime among them. But by the time you get to the Roman Empire, you have a lot of figurines and great statues that we still see today getting put up all around as an indication that Rome was here, and they are all inscribed in stone, marble, granite, etc., with very definite messages. So again, that tie to politics and the written word. On a lot of Roman statues, you'll see SPQR, or if you watch the Russell Crowe Gladiator film, it's the tattoo that he cuts off himself. That stands for Senat and Populusque Romanum, the Senate and people of Rome. That is the official, what we would call the USDA government stamp of approval. That was the Roman equivalent. They put it on everything that they touched. It was, hey, we are here by the power of the Senate and people of Rome, respected. Well, stone is rather indelible. So again, we have these early examples of, concepts of written word. Back to another bit though. All right, so the Sumerian civilization, as we discussed there in the Fertile Crescent, we're going to kickstart the concept of the government forming with the state. It began in Lower Mesopotamia, which again, Sumeria, Sumer, if you prefer, S-U-M-E-R, one of your key vocab terms there. In general, the agrarians, is agrarian civilization, so they were growing grains to, sustain themselves. And as we discussed, excess grain typically leads to governments. Small competing kingdoms or city-states were the general name of the game. If you follow, what was that HBO show? Game of Thrones. There's competing kingdoms that are all kind of more or less the kingdom is a city and maybe a little around it. Well, same concept in history in this part of the world. You had, a lot of ones that you'll recognize from perhaps like pre-biblical history, Akkadians being prime among them that we're going to talk about. But, different tribes, city-states that had formed in this part of the world. And as ones typically do, kingdoms become more powerful than one another by virtue of trade or conquest. Well, as we go on, that exact thing is going to happen. First, you have to get united in a sense, though, before you can get to an empire. And on that note, we're going to talk about, where did I get to? Sorry. Wow, this is messy. There it is. All right. So some things that we understand about the Sumerian and soon to be Akkadian, that again we'll get to in just a moment, society. We get through, again, the earliest forms of written text. Theirs being Sumerian written text, is a very distinct thing in history. It's, again, the first that we have proof of, but it was called cuneiform or cuneiform, again, depending on your preferred inflection, C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M, cuneiform, one of your vocab terms again. So the way that cuneiform works is you would have clay tablets, which again, once you bake them, become pretty permanent, which is going to help historians know why they existed. But you also have a stylus, what we think of now as, kind of to write on iPads with. Theirs was just a reed or a, sharpened stick that had a little, pencil point on it. They would take that and press different symbols into their clay tablet, and those symbols were acknowledged to be their earliest form of not an alphabet, but more of like a pictorial language, kind of like you think of Egyptian hieroglyphics later, where, bird with wavy lines underneath it means, Osiris over the river. It can also mean O in a word, something equivalent, if you will. Each of the different designs that they would make in the clay tablet with that stylus meant a different thing. Again, more related to raw information, numbers, population, payments, etc. Marriage was another one that we now know was big on the, to know how to notate list. So divorce goes all the way back to Sumerian society, by the way, just throwing that out there, not a new concept. And we know that again because they recorded it with cuneiform. But as far as being able to write in this very specific style with, again, clay you can make pretty much anywhere, but knowing how to make it into a specific tablet that you can then imprint, bake, and have it say the same thing, you have to have a great deal of skill on several levels. People to make the tablets, people to make the stylus. Importantly, you start seeing the first schools in Sumeria, Mesopotamia, and they were for creating scribes, or people who knew how to write cuneiform, or any language in this case, but cuneiform being the language of the day, scribes had to be taught. The king was likely not capable of reading and writing cuneiform. Many of the priests might not have been capable of reading and writing the language of the day. But if you took, and I mean all the way down to the bottom of society, frequently slaves, which they had back in the day, were normally gotten through combat, but more on that later in a different chapter. Many slaves were actually educated to be scribes. So you see, lower members of society becoming scribes too. Maybe they would be the king's scribe. But if a priest needed a scribe or, someone of a lesser stature, yeah, slaves were used as scribes. But it was a fairly lengthy process. Again, though, first time that we see schools as we recognize them now, a set curriculum with standards being applied. So, there with the written language again. The Egyptians, and this is a side note, but the Egyptians developed their own language much later that was separate from the symbols, the hieroglyphics that you see. It's called hieratic. It is not featured heavily in wall scriptures. It's much more what you would read on a papyrus scroll. So once we get to Egypt, we'll talk more about it perhaps, but as a comparison, it's much easier to write than cuneiform, but more on that. All right, so the Sumerian text, Gilgamesh, I talked about it probably every class since the beginning. That is our first record of a text that is written purely for entertainment. They would have viewed it as religious mythology. You can still go and pick up a copy, the Epic of Gilgamesh, probably in our bookstore. If not, certainly the library. Was carved on a number of extremely large clay tablets, all of which still exist today, or at least I think 9/10 of them do. And the rest is just recorded through vocal, oral history. Either way, it's, again, like I said before, a fascinating tale of the rise of a powerful king who starts seeing himself as perhaps more than human and, has an interplay with a number of gods, making them a polytheistic society. So again, one of your vocab terms to work in there. They celebrated multiple deities, hundreds of them in this case. But the Sumerians, Egyptians, many of these cultures, you will notice one common thing. They are poly or multiple theistic. Poly gods, multiple gods. So please make note of that. That is going to be a big distinction between our later chapter, the Hebrews, and their monotheistic religion, proto-Christianity, if you will. So again, know the difference, polytheistic, multiple gods, monotheistic, solo. All right, so to the unification of Mesopotamia. As frequently happens with, wars, civil wars, etc., all wars, you will notice leaders coming to the forefront. Back in this time, it was typically by virtue of being a good combatant, good fighter. We'll see that is sometimes the case, sometimes not. But in the case of Mesopotamia, becoming one giant area, took away the map. To unite all of that, as I mentioned down here, being where they talk about in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So again, there it is. Down in this area is where you had a lot of interplay between the city-states that allowed for financial gain. It was much better to live down in the walled cities of Ur and Uruk than it was to live up north near Asia Minor on the map, if you will, or the Syrian desert. Obviously, no one wants to live in a desert, right? Well, lo and behold, out of the north came a guy named Sargon, or Sargon, Sargon. He was Sargon the Great to history, to us now, if you prefer. He was one of a line of Sargons in Mesopotamia, actually, but we'll get to that in a moment. Actually, that works well. Okay, so again, you see Sumer down here, and then you've got Assyria up there. Well, Sargon decided that it was a good idea to, join a few of these city-states, originally through the sword, through military conquest. We'll see that most leaders through history, including who we could consider the very first unifier of any great kingdom, Sargon conquered a few of the surrounding people, but then he started offering them, instead of death, let's trade, let's benefit each other. And that was appetizing. If you don't have a big army, say you've only got 100 people in your small little city state, or a couple of thousand. Let's make it real, a couple of thousand. Out of 10,000 people, maybe you only have an army of 250. Well, if Sargon comes marching in with an army of 5,000, I mean, yeah, that's tiny by army standards today, but that is way more than enough, right? So, yeah, he might make a show, he being Sargon, of defeating your army. But after he defeated your army, and heavy air quotes on that, normally people would just surrender, open their gates. He did a couple of really smart things, something that the Romans would do thousands of years later. If I conquer you, and then I more or less enslave you, if I step away to go and conquer someone else, what are y'all likely to do while I'm gone? Rebel, perhaps? Or at least talk about it. You're at least going to talk about it. Because, no internet, no cameras, no phones at the time. If you talk about it, unless there is just the world's biggest snitch, I'm never going to know. So you may as well. And when you may as well go ahead and rebel. But if I come in and just prove to you that my army clearly could just lay waste to y'all, all of you. My army is... cavalry will take you out before I even get out of bed in the morning. It becomes so apparent that I can do that to y'all, but I don't want to. Instead, I offer you a way out. Let me destroy your walls, because you don't need them anymore. You got me. You're part of us now. He goes in, destroys those walls, but doesn't destroy temples, doesn't destroy markets, doesn't destroy people's homes. He offers them more or less what we would see now as citizenship in the growing empire. So, pretty smart move on his part. Because again, if you have 5 rebellions going on all around your empire, you may as well call it a day. You can't defend that. You split your army 5, 6 different ways. But if you have happy citizens, if you have happy city-states, now they all benefit. We all benefit. You get some of my grain, I get some of your gold. Y'all send me horses because you raise good horses. I give you protection from the people trying to steal your horses. It all works out. Well, it all works out when you grow government with that. The point of this whole discussion today. The growth of that government, the state. So you can see where it's starting to step up now, right? Like you're starting to see a little more what we still have today coming out here, yeah? You pay your taxes, you don't rebel. The government on top doesn't want to upset the boat, right? Not to give a dark outlook on political life or anything, but a little bit. A little bit. So, with that, again, let's go ahead and skip on over to my last page of notes that I have in writing. Scary territory, y'all. Let's talk about just like day-to-day Sumerian life. So again, this is the first society, first people that comes up with a recognized form of writing that we can still interpret today. Does that mean that we have like a go onto your iPhone translate app for ancient Sumerian cuneiform? Not at all. The only reason we understand it in large part is because people kept rewriting it until the next form of writing came out. And because it's a great epic, of course they kept rewriting it in this new form of writing. The story wanted to carry on. They wanted to carry on the story for future generations. Well, that keeps happening throughout history until it gets to a core language that we still all understand, be it like a Proto-Arabic language that's similar to Hebrew in modern tongue, or one of the other core languages that Latin, Greco-Roman, different languages that we still recognize today. So while it is recorded in cuneiform, and thus we know what it says, it's kind of hard to exactly go back and look at what is on the original tablets and be able to go, okay, this symbol means A, or this symbol means the. But we know what it says by virtue of those translations into the modern languages. So, again, small digression. But with that translation comes, even though it's mythological in base, again, God's playing around with a kind of like a demigod king of the southern part of the Fertile Crescent, Gilgamesh by the name, of course, the reason they name it the Epic of Gilgamesh. But it gives us a glimpse of things that actually existed within that society. Again, why do we know that Sargon asked for walls to be destroyed? Well, because Ur, the city in Gilgamesh, is called the Great City of Ur and Uruk, cities plural. And they are known for having extraordinarily high walls. And these walls we have dug up, and they still exist, sadly not on the slide behind me, but believe me, they do. You can actually search it on Google currently if you want to. URUK ruins, Uruk ruins. And there are great walls that we still see evidence of today, buried in many cases. But there's record of Sargon asking them to destroy these walls, to bring them down, to become part of the greater whole. And guess what? The evidence bears that out. So, Gilgamesh is a mythical epic. But you can see, because of that, we get a lot of proof of how Sumerian society functioned. They had a king. I mean, you wouldn't tell a myth about a king if you didn't have a king, right? I mean, you're probably making famous a king by telling this story. Theoretically, one named Gilgamesh. So, it starts off as a tale to honor the king, and soon it becomes myth, and then myth becomes legend, and then legend becomes modern day literature that bores you all to tears when you have to read it. But either way, you get what I'm saying. All right, so religion in the afterlife. Again, I mentioned that pretty much all of the cultures we're going to discuss in this chapter, minus Judaism, the Hebrew faith, are polytheistic. Again, multiple gods. Gods for everything. The water rising, the water falling, the sun coming up, the sun going down. Partly cloudy days, sort of sunny days. All of them get a god. They're not all as important as others, but it's kind of like, hey, is there an occurrence that you don't know why it happens? Lightning striking? Zeus, later on in Greek and Roman literature, because they don't understand the science of it. You don't know it's the imbalance of protons and electrons and neutrons between Earth and sky generated by movement in the clouds. They didn't know that stuff, y'all. What they did know, though, was there was a big, powerful god up top that was throwing lightning bolts. Right. As you start to be able to science away certain things, you start noticing that a lot of those deities start disappearing. How it happens. But that's a long way in the future. That's later in class. Back to Sumeria. Polytheistic, nature gods. Again, you see a lot of the fertility gods that carry through from our earliest ancestors. Again, it was very round, very obviously pregnant female figurines early on. You start seeing that in paintings and tile work and sculptures still in this culture. So it carries on. Fertility is a big deal still now, but certainly back then when, the whole world population was millions and not many millions, reproduction is a big deal then. So ziggurats, or again, what is pictured there, more or less, those are our earliest proof in this part of the world, thus what we believe to be the oldest. Proof of, architecture devoted to what we believe to be spiritual, or if it's more political, then honorary in nature. Maybe it was the priests that hung out here. Famous people were certainly buried within them or around on the grounds. Was it were these meant to glorify a king, or were these meant to glorify the religion or religious leaders? That we're not entirely sure of. But they exist clearly as a point of dominance because they are inevitably in the center of all of these cultures, all of these little civilizations that are starting. These ziggurats, which again I believe is a vocab term, so nota bene. Babylon being, Tower of Babylon, again, both religious and, not to discredit Christianity, but historically, pure sans religion views on Babylon. Babylon became most well known for a very tall ziggurat that history calls the Tower of Babylon. Not Babel, excuse me, not Babylon. There it is. Again, the religious context behind the significance of the Tower of Babel withstanding, there is no abject proof of the concept of language springing from this point, but biblical history being what it is, if that is your choice, then that is what you understand. I will accept that on a test. I'm not biased in that way. Personally, I just recognize it as the tallest ziggurat in Babylon. Either way, beyond that. Mesopotamian religion, not optimistic. Christianity, typically, pretty cheerful outcome. You accept Jesus, you are forgiven of your sins, you're likely going to the good place. Not if you've watched the show The Good Place, because the good place was the bad place, then it was the neutral place, and then it was the kind of happy place. But anyway, this was not a big, happy, cheery religion. It was kind of like, okay, you exit a life of okay living to an afterlife of okay-ish living. Like, that said, important to note, it does come with an acknowledgement of an afterlife, which still new in the general history of the world. I mean, in that we can trace it through written texts. Certainly, I believe that Paleolithic societies believed in the beyond. That's what a lot of their cave paintings were about. But this is an afterlife proper that we're thinking of, right? Early on, good stuff. Again, not a lot of loving relationships between humans and gods. Men and women were slaves to their god creators. Generally dreary outcome and settings, but punishments were natural catastrophes, be they floods, droughts, disease, and again, go back to previous class to note, these cultures were increasingly reliant on domestication of animals and plants. And with animals, and with poisonous plants, but let's focus on animals, you have the growth of a lot of diseases that we still recognize today. Many of our pox, chicken, cowpox, sorry, there it is. Any of the pox, diseases that we still deal with today, many of them came from these earliest humans getting a little too close to where they let their animals poop and eat. Because, sanitation was not a thing at this time. If it's not actively bleeding or brown with dirt or sand on it, it was pretty okay to eat, right? Well, we know a little bit better now with viruses and bacterial studies, but there again, closeness of animals to the human population, you get a big increase in diseases, which are then spread along trade routes, and the people that raise the animals, say again, horse farmers over here, goat farmers over there. Once these people who are good with their horse diseases come and trade with y'all, there's going to be a little trade back and forth between the diseases, and y'all are going to lose people and y'all are going to lose people. But in the long run, you both kind of get over each other's diseases. Consequently, the paper that I assigned this semester will have to do with the concept of just that, the effects of that trading of disease, of plagues, of epidemics. So as you go through the rest of this course until I put the assignment up and it gives you a fuller idea, anytime you're reading your textbook or any extraneous information, if you see epidemic, plague, consequences of disease, any way it's written, make a note of that, put it in a folder, whatever you have to do. It might help you in your paper. Good note. Okay. So, as I'm sure many of you have gotten to the bottom here, God's peace with rituals and ceremonies by priests. So, with that, you see a little bit of glorification of religious leaders, something that we're all very still familiar with today, whatever your religious choices are. I think we can all acknowledge the Pope is generally better thought of than our average Joe in the world, for whatever reason. The head of Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, is thought of as a very pure and genuine, just genuinely good person. And if you watch his interviews, it's hard not to agree with that stance. He's just lovely. It's like everybody's granddad, But so you see, even to this day, where religious leaders are higher than your average Joe. It goes all the way back to Mesopotamian Sumerian societies. Again, potentially with ziggurats being their place, but Beneath the king, you now have religious leaders. Beneath that, you start developing other hierarchies, eventually getting to the bottom where slaves are. However, even in this society, it was better to be the slave of the king than the slave of a poor person. Even within the society, those differences were recognized. So by the time we get to Sumeria, and again, Sargon uniting into making it, the Akkadian Empire, if you prefer it, you start seeing very, very minute differences in recognition between what you do and what you do and where you fit in society. Like this whole male-dominated, female, power movement. This is not new, y'all. This has been going back to this point, and very shortly after. We'll get there. Point in fact, Sargon, another first that he did, was employed nepotism. You don't know what that is? It's putting someone that's related to you in positions of power. Yeah, when he conquered somewhere, he would put one of his sons in to be governor. First time that had happened. Guess how he grew a strong empire? Your kid's not going to say no. He's going to do what he needs to make sure that dad's happy, right? I have a newborn son. I'd like for that to be true. Either way, he put his daughter in as head priestess at the main temple in Ur. Obviously a very important city. I've said the name 3-4 times now. So again, you see that he's pulling in religion, he's pulling in government control, he's bringing it all into himself. And again, there's a reason he's known as the first emperor, first empire, the Akkadians. So Akkadians, Akkadians, I believe, being the name of Sargon's eventual, combined north and south territories of Mesopotamia, the entire Fertile Crescent, if you prefer. He extended trade all the way into modern India. So again, let's see if I can pull this map back up relatively quickly. Oh, there's an up close of a ziggurat. Not bad, right? Clearly, people knew what they were doing. Those bricks are pretty consistent. That's some good math going into building that. It's architecturally sound enough to be standing after 7,000 years. I don't know about y'all, but my house was built in the 50s. It's not going to be here in 7,000 years. This is impressive. All right. Boo hiss. I don't have the map pulled back up without going too far back. Either way, take it for granted when I say that the Fertile Crescent, while not distant by our modern standards from China, India, is very distant by the standards of the day. So the fact that Sargon the Great, in all of his greatness, did all of these things to unify the north and the south of Mesopotamia into the Akkadian Empire, more impressive still was the fact that he expanded it with trade routes all the way to India and China. And I do this because it's different sides of where his empire was. So again, super impressive, y'all. Super, super impressive. Some other things that came out of Sumerian society, not just under Sargon, but in the greater context of time, other things that we view as historians that make this, the first great recognizable civilization. I hate that term. Organized society. Civilization implies that others are not civilized, and that's become kind of a normal historic thing to say is you don't say civilized anymore. That's rude. You say, recognized societies, perhaps. I agree with that stance, by the way. I've always thought it's a little like, oh, that's a little conqueror's attitude there. Like, yeah, we're civilized. They're not. Either way. Some other things that came up, I mentioned the concept of math early on with writing. Time, the cyclical nature of time, sun up, sun down, certain number of days before it gets warm, certain number of days before it gets hot, certain number of days before it starts to get lukewarm, and then cold, the seasons that we recognize. Well, the Sumerians developed a system of numbers, what we believe to be one of the first, that was based on the number 60, or 6, 10, and thus 60. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute. Ring true? It's still with us today. This first concept of how to measure time, as humans, we agree with so well, it is still with us today, thousands of years later, pretty much untampered with. So, real cool. Lunar months, again, that same concept of numbers and time. how many days before a recognizable change in weather or season happens, right? Mathematics, which again we touched on already, the idea of a concept of value of a number. Again, theirs being a 6, 10, and 60 being kind of the core numbers that they worked with. I think we're much more of like the basing it on 100 type now, factors of 10, both down to 5 and up to 100 or 1,000 or a million or whatever. We just like to add zeros behind a 1. They like to add zeros behind a 6. There you go. The concept of zero, which again, in relation to positive and negative, originally, wrap your mind around this. If you're out of crops, you're just out of crops. Once you have the concept of zero, you now can go, okay, we have 0 crops, but we made this much more than last year. Go take that back to 0. We made this much less the year before. You now have the concept of negative in math, which again works in the favor of taxes and record keeping more than it affects, storytelling and daily lives. But it's hugely important when you're trying to send stuff into space now, like hugely important. So there's 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in our geometry, around circle, 360 degrees. More on that. Again, this is the record keeping reflected taxation, marital status, inheritance. Guess what? Marital status definitely favored men back in the time. One of those things that came out of Sargon the Great, favoring his men in governmental positions or his sons, grandsons, as the head of local governments that would then, their sons became rulers of, etc., for about 150 years. Obviously, that patriarchal line was established in the very first society that we acknowledge. With that, the divorce decrees, laws, etc., they favored men. Like, sorry, ladies, you couldn't divorce your husband, but your husband could sure as heck divorce you for any number of reasons. Wanting to get another lover, most common probably. Your failure to make a child, because remember, it was your fault at the time. Suspected infidelity, he could actually have you killed. So don't give him a reason to suspect. So clearly in that vein, it goes down the line. It clearly favored men. This was also true of inheritance and tax, etc. Kind of a common through line until more modern times. You start seeing the emergence of queens in Egypt, but they were quickly replaced by younger brothers. Sorry. There's the cuneiform again mentioned. That was circa 3500 BCE. We believe that Gilgamesh, again, the first epic literature being the focus of that, not just facts, came out very soon after the pure invention of writing in this sense. So it wasn't, thousands of years on, they finally came up with this idea of entertaining literature. No, it was pretty much at the same time. A couple of 100 years one way or the other, who's to say? All right, let's check it on time. Okay, we got about 20 odd more minutes. I think that gives us plenty of time for what I'm going to cover today. We are now going to switch to, okay, so let me end out the last bit as y'all are catching up on notes. As always happens, empires do not last forever. Sargon's Akkadian Empire lasted about 150 years. Call it 4 or 5 generations of grandkids down the line. But eventually, internal strife, drought, changes in climate, all of these things come together to, make an empire come in on the decline. Later in time, we'll study later in this class where, inbreeding becomes a big problem with watching your empire decline. But sorry, Europe. Later, it's a joke you'll get at the end of class, I promise. Like end of semester class. Either way, Hammurabi. Many of you have heard of him. Yeah, Hammurabi's code. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Yeah, cool. So Babylon, or the, Babylon being his kingdom as well as the active city center, the capital, circa 1700 BCE. So again, circa being maybe it was a few years before, a few years after. We have a pretty good recollection, though, or record of it, because again, Akkadians had adopted cuneiform from Sumeria and made it the standard to record. Sargon was a very wise man. Don't write this down, but just as a note, he spoke like 2-3 languages easy, and one of them is something that modern Arabic and Hebrew speakers would actually recognize core and root words from. So, he adopted cuneiform because the Akkadians in the north didn't have writing necessarily, not good writing, but he made his language, the language of the north, the language of all of Mesopotamia. So again, you see that flow of ideas, you adopt some, you give others, all the way through history, certainly at the earliest point. But again, that didn't last forever. So circa 1700 BCE, you get this guy coming in with his Babylonian forces. This guy being Hammurabi. He's certainly not the only leader. His son had quite a bit of fame, grandson too, on down the line. Again, male-dominated, sorry ladies. But in general, his legal code is considered to be the first written down legal code. I mean, again, Paleolithic societies had to have some, non-written agreement between, hey, you steal my stuff, I make you dead. Like, that's a law code, and if it's understood, it didn't have to be written down, but it's in place nonetheless before Hammurabi's code. However, ... Hammurabi's code is inscribed, it's written down, and that makes it the first and thus unique. Punishments depended on social rank. Does this sound familiar? If you can afford to get your way out of it, are you going to do it? Most likely. Goes all the way back, y'all. If you were rich, you could get away with absolutely murder. And in Hammurabi's code, I do mean that literally. Like, so long as you killed someone of a lower rank, you could pretty much get off with it. Yeah, you might pay a fine. You might get caned in public once or twice, but you got away with murder. Literally legal. Commoners and slaves were, of course, treated more harshly than nobles, as I think that's a good example of. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth does not sound like the balanced justice system that I want to live under, but when you realize that it brought a sense of, not on a social level, but if we're all peers in this room, the same laws apply to all of us, it brought a sense of equality to the masses. You're equally culpable if I'm equally culpable. Makes us behave a little differently, a little more societal minded. Hey, if I can't kill you, we may as well make it better to live here, right? Because, if I kill you, I'm going to get killed. But if we work together, there's no laws that say we can't work together, right? So we're working together? Good. Okay, we see how, that's going to work a little bit. Again, government was supposed to be an impartial referee. Wealth did not make that the truth, rather got in the way, as it frequently does. Not equal before the law, husbands over wives. Again, I noted that earlier. Fathers over children. If you want to beat your kid in the middle of the street, beat your kid in the middle of the street. It's fine under the law with Hammurabi's code. That hurts because, again, newborn at home, that makes me very sad, but history does not make us happy. It just is. And then free citizens over slaves. There you go. It goes all the way back, y'all. Here again. Don't freeze up on me, computer. All right, so Hammurabi's empire. This is, again, I think I should probably stop before too much longer after this. I want to cover Egypt as one fell swoop in a day. I don't want to divide it up. 2 classes. Either way, if we get much further than this, I'll try and dial it back and refocus on something we've already spoken of, so we can do that. Either way, Hammurabi's empire looks a little bit different than the earliest Sumerian empire or Akkadian empire, right? Akkadians went up a bit more, followed that Tigris River up towards the top and curved. Well, this one follows more the Euphrates River down along the south. A lot of historians believe that is because that is where Sargon's descendants, militaries, were least powerful. Obviously you have a military. You're not going to keep them all in your capital city. You spread them out along your empire so they can quell rebellions. Well, you only got so many guys, so you hedge your bets, right? Sargon had come from the north, a very warrior culture. So he definitely, in his mind and his grandkids' minds, would have thought, we came from the north because we're warriors. Probably if we need to defend a border, let's make it heavy at the north. So you see this, second empire developing conveniently in their territory on the southern side, where perhaps they didn't see it coming, some would say. Either way, Hammurabi's empire grew through, again, a good network of trade, and increasingly taking over just what was previously the Sumerian trade routes. But, good leaders adapt and take the good ideas of the past. What can you say? That being said, let's look at where we're at, again, in relation to the map as a whole. Let's write down here, desert. You don't grow much in the desert. Second half of this class, 1020, we'll talk about the Safavid Empire, which took hold about 2,000 years after where we are now. That is modern day, Iran, Persia, whichever you prefer that to be. But even they, 2,000 years later, would be incredibly confined by their lack of resources, especially water. Because again, to grow your population, what have we established that we need? Food, farming especially, but yes, food. Farming needs water. If you don't have it, your population stays small because you can't feed it. That being said, ... still in 1020, but it applies here too. Deserts are your friend for a number of reasons. Most importantly, if you have a small army and a small empire, you have to make your enemies go across the desert. There's a lot fewer of them that are, one, going to live through it, and two, going to be willing to try in the first place. So you don't end up fighting a lot of battles with the outside world. Again, less true of Acadians right now, more true of where we'll get to if y'all are with me in next semester's 1020 course, and I hope you are. But all right, so with that, we've covered pretty much everything that I wanted to get to in today's lecture, because again, Egypt I like to do as a little bit bigger concept all in one day so as to just make it easier in notes. So with that, I'm going to